welcome. First of all, thank you for joining us. We are not EastEnders. This is not Phil and Grant Mitchell. You have tuned in to the FAP unit webinar. We will start off just with a little bit of housekeeping before we introduce ourselves. So on that screen, you can see the rules. I'm not going to go through all of them. We are recording, so please keep any chat that you got there professional and respectful. I was on another little call earlier today, and they sent me a YouTube link afterwards, and it was about NASA in 1977. So I'm going to go off on one a little bit here. But in 1977, NASA sent a Voyager space shuttle type thing, I guess, out into orbit, and they knew that it was probably never going to return. And now, all these years later, they estimate that it's something like 12 billion light years or 12 billion miles or some very, very long way away. And they knew it was never going to come back. So when they sent this spaceship into orbit, they put some communications on there in case it was picked up by aliens. And it was kind of like some literature and various different ways of messaging saying, you know, this is the planet Earth and this is what we do here and this is how it all works. And in the hope that some alien life form would pick it up. And I think I was reflecting that's a little bit what it's like running a webinar. We're sending messages out into the cosmos somewhere, and I've got this computer in front of me, and it tells me there's lots of people on a chat box, but I can't see you and I can't hear you, and I'm hoping that you'll pick up the messages that we're sending. The only real feedback we've got is in this chat box, so it will whiz through pretty quick with this many people on the call, but if there are questions, that's the best way of putting them across. So keep communicating with us. If things don't make sense, let us know. We did a call this morning and we want to try and make it a little bit more interactive and a little bit more geared to you. So we're going to introduce ourselves now and then find out a little bit about who's in the room. So that's us in action shot. I was obviously a bit colder then than I am today. So my name's Mark Carter. I work for the FAP unit, and it's worth maybe just mentioning what we do as a unit first. So we believe in the power of PE to make a difference to people's lives. We support coaches who work in schools, teachers, teaching assistants, PE subject leads, teacher trainees, and tutors on teacher training courses to empower the deliverers of PE, support them, inspire them, because we want to make the subject more impactful and more powerful for the children, essentially. I work in North London. I've been in the PE unit for 2 or 3 years. My particular passion is play, and in particular, the connection and joy that happen when people come together to play and move. I've worked as a secondary school teacher for a few years, and immediately before joining the FAP unit, I was a primary PE consultant, watching from the sidelines a lot of what was going on, and that started my fascination with this subject in particular. Over to you, Mr. Welburn.
Good afternoon, all. First and foremost, I hope everybody's safe and well, and the relative family members are as well. My name's Chris Welburn. I've had the pleasure of working for the FA's Physical Education Unit since its inception in 2013. 7 marvellous years working in the North. I currently look after the Greater Manchester patch. We're ably supported today by Chris Bramall and Ryan Davies, who both work in the North, and we've got some fantastic IT support from our wonderful team at the FA with Morgan and Kelly as well. So we hope you delve into the content and enjoy this next hour or so.
Great, thanks, Chris. So something we could do that will help us know you a little bit better is find out a little bit about you. So Ryan's going to put a poll up on the screen now, which we'd like you to answer. Simply just describe what you're doing this year. So this is this academic year, the one that ends in July, and let us know which of those roles best describes you, just so we get an idea of who you all are. Okay, we were expecting it to be very ITT heavy, but that's fantastic. We've got a lot of qualified teachers. I'll just give you a few more seconds if you haven't quite decided what you are, what role to answer. Brilliant. Okay. So this afternoon is about teachers. We do every Thursday for the last few weeks, and continuing next week, we do two of these webinars each week. The morning one is geared at coaches and sports coaches who work in curriculum time in schools. This is about teachers. So we're going to be looking at this from a teacher's angle, but that includes teaching assistants. That includes people who are going to be teachers or aspirations to be teachers. Other people on the call, welcome. We hope you get something out of this as well. I'm sure that we will be talking about the relationship, for example, between teachers and coaches at some point. Anything else you wanted to add, Wells, before we kick on?
No, excited to get going.
All right, let's do it. Let's find out what we're going to do. So our next slide is the aims, what we planned for you. There's 3 aims, but what I've tried to do with each slide is on the left-hand side, just summarize it really, if you're not one of those people who likes to read lots of text. So the what and the why we will start with. The big thing there is we're going to make a powerful case that working together as a pair is a really good thing for the children if we get it right, and a really good way of developing ourselves and each other as professionals and practitioners. Most of the time, though, after that, we'll be spending looking at relationships and how we build them in the settings and contexts we work in, so essentially in schools. And we'll be leaning heavily on your experience. So we want to know a little bit about how you've done it, what success looks like for you. And you've already started telling us about that. Wells is going to focus towards the end of our time together today on models to use when you coach together. We will finish at 5 o'clock. Let's get cracking. So the what and the why. We'll start with the definition. There's lots out there. We've chosen one each. The top one is the one Wells chosen. The bottom one's the one I've chose after going away and reading a lot of the literature. But you'll see the key thing there is that this is about planning, presentation, and evaluation in the top one, and in the bottom one, preparing, planning, teaching, and evaluating the results. So it's really clear that when we talk about team teaching, we're not talking about turning up and just delivering. That might be described as co-delivery. What we're talking about here is the power of working together to consider your context and the children's needs, to plan something for them, whether that's a lesson or a series of lessons, deliver together, and then review and evaluate. In fact, that review and evaluate will carry on. There's a sort of mini cycle that goes on within that as well, a sort of within the lesson perhaps, which Chris will talk about a little bit later. Potential benefits of team teaching. So I'm going to tell a little story at this point. So I'm actually a student at the moment, as well as being everything else I'm trying to do. And I'm a student at University of Worcester, and I'm doing a postgrad certificate in sports coaching. Doing it part-time, so it's usually once a month. We'll go up there for spend a couple of days, and it's been 25 years since I was last in university, and my first degree was in statistics, so I didn't really do that much reading, really. It was just numbers. So it's all very new and a little bit scary at times, trying to get my head around all this academic language. And I think the tutors on the course have been fantastic, because what they've realised, there's lots of people in the same situation, and they conduct the webinars and seminars and workshops together in really interesting ways. And typically what they do is one of them will be at the front of the room, and they will present the material in a very academic way, because they need us to understand words like epistemology and ontology and things. And this is all very new to us, but they can't really dumb it down. They need us to understand that, because that's the level that we're going to be working at. But their colleague at the back of the room will be playing a little bit of a devil's advocate role and a little bit of a, hey, I don't really get it role. And occasionally we'll just jump in with, hang on a minute, are you saying, because last time we were together you said this and now you seem to be saying that, how are we meant to keep up with all this? And they'll make it relevant and they'll put it in our language, and the 2 hours with them sort of feels like 2 hours, where I think if it was dry solo delivery it could feel more like 10 hours. And it's obvious that they're well practiced at this, and it's something that they've developed over time. But as a teaching process, it makes the content digestible, it makes the time that we share together interesting, and it makes it relatable. And that's just a really good example for me of a team teaching experience that I've really thoroughly enjoyed, and it's lent something to me. So there are potential benefits. The slide should be now back on the screen. So in the literature, these are the ones that come up. So Chris and I've spent a bit of time doing some reading. There's probably other things that you might want to add to this list. I want to focus on a couple of these. I think the key message, as always, is on the left-hand side. Team teaching can develop the pupil, certainly, but also the practitioner. So if we think about the pupil first, more involvement and feedback per child, I think this is critical. So how often in PE, especially if we're delivering on our own, do we really get a chance to work with individuals? Do we get a chance to observe somebody work in this class of 30 children where we might get 40 minutes, observe someone in particular, give them some feedback, give them some Q&A that's personal to them and their experience, understand where they're at, help them, send them back into the activity to see how they cope, and then follow that up with repeat interventions to really embed the learning. It's really difficult, isn't it? And if we have two people there, there's more chance of that happening. So I think that's first sort of bullet point there about involvement of feedback is absolutely critical. The other one I want to take us down to, we'll cover a lot of the others as we go, but is the very bottom one, morale and enthusiasm. I'm guessing that of those hundreds of teachers and TAs that are on the call today, that there are quite a few who maybe PE isn't their favourite subject. Maybe they get out into the playground and it isn't the best experience for them. It's something that they're happy when they finish. And actually, what team teaching allows is for us to have someone there with us who we can talk to during the lesson, before it, get some support from. And I think it's really important that we see the benefits to our sort of psychological outlook of PE if we do it well with somebody else. That it might not be still the most enjoyable subject, but we have someone who can listen to our thoughts about it and encourage us and give us some of that enthusiasm from them. So that's just some of those benefits, and we'll go into those a little bit more detail as we go along. However, it is also worth pointing out that it doesn't necessarily work automatically. This study by Fawcett in California looked at primary PE delivered in two different ways. So some classes by a single teacher and others by pairs of teachers. And what they found is that the single teacher delivery was much more able to stick to the school curriculum for PE. Whereas pairs, when they did it together, they'd often leave the not so nice bits that they figured, they didn't really want to do to the other person. And actually the children didn't get a very varied approach at all. And the curriculum wasn't covered. So we can't just assume it's going to work. This is going to, like all relationships, take a bit of work. The study by Anderson and Speck, we've got all the references for you if you want to read these yourself. But the key thing that they noted, which was probably common among all the literature, was that it was about compatibility. Some of you have already mentioned that, I think, as we've in the initial question about double acts. And how they define that a little bit is working together harmoniously by embracing a similar philosophy and vision for your class. While preparing for this webinar, I went online a lot and tried to find out how do you deliver a webinar connected and personalized to people, and how do we connect well? And one of the things was we have to ask rhetorical questions, it told me. So this is my first rhetorical question for you. Do you know your philosophy and vision for a PE lesson and for a PE program? Is that something you think would be the same as your numeracy and literacy lessons, or is it different because it's PE? How much do you know yourself? Because I think when we go on to talk about relationships, we need to start with ourselves. What do we want to get out of PE? What value do we see? A couple of weeks ago, our team did a webinar on holistic development beyond the physical, and it was really getting at this idea that PE doesn't have to be about just technical physical outcomes. PE is a marvelous vehicle for embracing social growth, thinking skills, collaboration, following rules, playing fairly, winning and losing, all the things that actually, if you do well, it will help you throughout the year. So knowing that yourself and being clear on what it is you want to get out of it is the beginning, I think, of a team teaching relationship that can work. Just before we do that, I wondered if Wells, was anything that you wanted to comment on. Feel free to say no. I just thought I'd allow a chance for you to chip in if you wanted to at that stage.
No, just some fantastic chats coming along in the box, actually, and I probably want to urge you to do to keep sort of like dissecting the content and putting your own opinions across, and then my colleagues Chris and Ryan will pick that up in due course, and just really interested in reading this as you're leading the first bit of content, Mark.
Fantastic. Okay, so let's go on to look at the how then. How does it work? Now, you're going to have some, unlike, I think, this morning to an extent when we're working with coaches, I think that teachers, given that a lot of you are saying you're already in schools teaching, or they're not, albeit not at the moment, you probably have very good relationships or very interesting relationships, and hopefully successful ones in the classroom already. So it might be worth, as we go through these slides, considering what is it about your relationship, maybe between teacher and TA, or teacher and the next door teacher, or the 2 year 5 teachers, or whatever it might be that really works for you. How have you developed that? What have you done? By sharing that in the chat box, maybe we can share that around so that people can learn from each other, because we do have people who are going to obviously be going into schools, hopefully in September, to start being teachers. And I wonder whether on your courses there's enough emphasis on relationships. So it could be an interesting few slides in terms of sharing our own experience. There's 4 questions to pose for you. And we're going to have a look at these in a little bit of detail. So this slide will be on for quite a while. I'd like you to really start considering these. The first one is about letting other people lead when you know that if you led, it would be all right, So we've all got a skill set that we're confident in. But really, we also know that learning happens by people trying stuff they're probably not so good at and getting better at it, hopefully. And in that process, probably making a few mistakes. So when we're working together with someone else, we've got to let both of those people have an autonomous role in that relationship so they can both deliver and both drive sometimes. If you've got someone who's very able and confident in PE, there's a sense that and a tendency that they just do everything. Well, actually, that's probably not the best way if we're really thinking about having a relationship that works for us both to develop. The second question, how willing am I to allow a colleague to see aspects of my teaching which I'm not particularly skilled? So I've had this experience in the last couple of years. So since joining the FAPE unit, I've been really encouraged to think about how I want to improve. And it's probably, of all the jobs I've had, the one where that's been most emphasized. And I've really enjoyed that aspect of it. And it was early on that I realized I was working with groups of mostly adult learners every week, sometimes 3 or 4 groups for a whole day. And I really, really, really wanted to get better at standing in front of them for a day and making an impact to them. That was the thing I wanted to get better at. In order to do that, I had to go through a process where I had to allow people who were close to me and who'd been doing this a bit longer to see how I delivered and take it apart a little bit. There's no real point in getting feedback if it's all going to be lovely. You need someone at some point to be a little bit critical and ask you some difficult questions. And that means that you have to be vulnerable. So in my example, with my line manager, who I'd already shared similar values and beliefs with, we had a very close relationship anyway, I was able to get them to record me on video and watch it, which is an uncomfortable situation at the best of times. And then sort of start thinking about what is it I do that I want to improve. So I'll share with you that the 2 things that came up is one was about making key messages during the delivery much more powerful and much more clear. And if you had to repeat things, that was okay, rather than go off on too many tangents. So that's something I've really been trying to work out. You can let me know via the chat box if I'm getting that across well in this webinar today. And the other thing that was interesting was more about how I am physically. I'm someone who fidgets. I do all this weird stuff with my face like this continually when I'm delivering face to face. In fact, if you look at pictures of me delivering, a lot of the time I'm like this. And I think people find it a little bit weird. So one of the bits of feedback was you got to find something else to do with your hands and be a bit more relaxed physically when you're actually delivering. And that's been really difficult for me. First of all, to allow a colleague to give me that feedback, but secondly, then to work on that. But I think that's the power, really, if you can find the relationship and make it work, that you can really start to grow as a person. But it requires the courage to be vulnerable in the first place. Chris, I'm going to pass you on to you for the next 2 questions.
Yeah, I think probably some of the points that have been raised so far are very much about this process is about people. It's about trust. It's about relationships. So I think if we look at the question that I'm aligning to here, to what degree do I believe that there is more than one right way to carry out almost any teaching stroke learning task? Well, I think this has got to come down to some philosophy agreement between the people that you work with. I think it's about beliefs, about practice. I think there's some really interesting points here about how you view learning and how they view teaching. What's the culture that's generated within your school? Is there a consensus that this is how we are going to collectively teach, or do you embrace throughout the year groups a different way of teaching and learning so that all the pupils embrace different types of and ways and approaches of going about the content? So I think that's a really interesting point for me. Question 4 about disagreements and issues and concerns. Well, if you are going to engage in team teaching, we've got to think about how we're going to get away from those pet peeves that people might get annoyed a little bit about, and how we can work around those. And then also, how can we get some parity between the colleagues? I think we've got to show to the pupils that, we are equal, and that we've got a real opportunity to benefit them through this team teaching. So for me, it's always about what needs inform the process. And what we're doing, hopefully, from a team teaching stroke co-teaching approach is putting the pupils' needs first, and trying to see how we can sort of like engage them through different perspectives. So I think it's always about the pupils for me, about how teaching is going to affect them in a positive way.
Okay. Given the amount of chat that's going on and the amount of really interesting input, it shows that there's a lot of thought going on. And I think it's probably a good time to bring in our co-presenters, Ryan Davies, Chris Bramall, just to sort of update us here before we go any further on some of the things that have been cropping up. So Ryan and Chris, I'll pass over to you just to give us a bit of an update on what might be happening in the chat box.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. So I kick off, Ryan.
Yep, absolutely.
Just to go back to the initial sort of question, really, so 3 things that stood out for me from looking at the chat box in terms of those key ingredients for that working as a pair were trust, teamwork, and communication. That they seem to be sort of themes that ran through, maybe in different words at times, but sort of ran through a lot of the comments. I particularly like Mary Magnan's, hope I pronounced your name right there, Mary, who talked about symbiotic relationship between the two, which I know you referred to that very phrase this morning, Mark.
I certainly did, yes, one of my new words.
I think it was, it did come across that, some of the things I'd written down, and thank you very much for your input. We've literally had hundreds of messages, you can probably see in the chat box, and just the words I wrote down that kept coming out, you're right, teamwork, communication, trust, chemistry, friendship, respect. And all those words are about those relationships with people, and that having a positive impact on this team teaching. And just trying to pick out a few things that people have said, some great examples as well. So Juliet Shepherd had talked about their school had introduced coaching buddies and teaching buddies within their PE, so that TAs and teachers were working together, which is a fantastic example. On that point, Chris Lee had mentioned about people, teachers don't necessarily, learn in the same way in terms of their development within PE. And again, that goes down to knowing the person, knowing where they're at in their own learning journey to help them in terms of their PE delivery, so that it's a really effective tool, team teaching. And I think ultimately the success in team teaching is the children having a better PE experience, either in that moment or in the future, because that team teaching is happening. And I think that can only happen thanks to the relationships that are built in order to make that an effective situation. And I think on that we've had a great question in. I'm going to pose to you, Brams, around do you feel that there should always be 2 adults in a PE lesson? It's coming from Margaret Hughes, who's posed that question. So I just really interested to get your thoughts around that.
Yeah, I saw that question actually. I've just been interested in some responses from people that they've put in, and it's a difficult one. We could almost do a webinar on this very topic, which we're not going to do. So I'll try and sort of summarise it as quick as I can. There's the issues in schools of TAs not always being present in every lesson. They might be shared, and there's an increase in resource drag on TAs into other areas. I guess it might come down.
I think Brams may have dropped out there. Okay. Sorry, Brams, you just cut up in the middle of that one.
Okay, am I back on?
Yes.
Okay. I guess it could come down to the school as well, and the ethos of the school, and how well the senior management buy into the importance of PE and school sport, whether or not TAs are involved. If not, I guess you've got your PE and school sport premium. The number one priority for that up to press. We'll see what happens with it going forward. Has been to help teachers get better at teaching PE. So if you can't have a TA in with you, then maybe think about using some of your PE and school sports premium to bring in a coach. I noticed someone, it flashed up too quickly, I didn't catch the name, but someone's had a Premier League Primary Stars coaching from Crystal Palace helping them out, and they've very much learnt off each other. Simon talked about bouncing ideas off his PE apprentice that he works with. and someone else talked about coaching buddies. So there's a whole host of opportunities to do it, even if the TA can't. Someone else talked about specialising, where if you've got an interest and a passion and subject knowledge and confidence around teaching PE, maybe you might do a little bit more PE delivery in your school. But again, that comes down to the sort of ethos of the school of, are we going down the specialist route of teachers in primary school, which we're not? So there's a whole host of questions around that for me. But from a personal perspective, I think I've got a better chance of delivering high quality PE if I've got someone with me who's engaged in the teaching and learning with me, who's not just there as an extra, if that makes sense.
So, and I think, that's come across, and Jane Conlon, I noticed as well, and said that, it's vital to have that buy-in from SLT as well. And just looking at the chat box right now, there's people talking about SLT and how important that is, and seeing PE, as equal value at least with other areas of the curriculum. Something as well, just before I hand back to you, Mark and Chris, that's coming up again and again is around, and it's something we referred to last week in the webinar for those who joined us, is around teachers and TAs being in kit when they're delivering PE. And I mentioned it last week about how important that is and the value that gives to the subject, to the children that we're working with, and also related to what we're talking about today. If I know that there's lots of schools who might have tracksuits or hoodies that the teachers might wear for PE, and it makes them look part of a team as well, doesn't it? And I don't think we can underestimate the value that can have.
Yeah, fantastic, cool, brilliant. Thanks. We'll be back with you shortly. So keep an eye, Ryan and Chris, on what's happened, and we'll catch up with you again a bit later. So to summarise that slide, which I think is really an important one, is those are some of the things on the left that came up for me when I was sort of answering these questions for myself. Of course, these things take time, and often we might not have that. I think when we talk to coaches, certainly it seems to be the biggest issue for them is that they can't find enough time to make relationships with the people in school that they work with. And it might be that for teachers in schools, it's about making time for PE. There's a lot coming in the chat about the importance of PE in different schools being different. But I think as teachers, we need to value the subject if we can and find time to talk about it outside of the lesson, rather than just turn up to the lesson and then try and find time within it. We've got to see if we can do that. I mean, what we offer as an FAPE unit and have offered in the past is inset for PE. There's 20 of us across the country, all taking different regions. We offer a one-day primary teachers award course, face-to-face course, once we're back doing that kind of delivery. We also offer a chance to come in and do some inset with you and work with your school. If that's what's needed to kickstart high-quality PE and discussions on PE, then that's maybe how you could use our team as well in future.
Yeah.
A quick one here then, your thoughts really. I think we've already started to discuss this, but I want to get a bit more specific now about skills and knowledge. So maybe thinking about your experience of the people you've worked with and reflecting and reviewing, well, how did you develop skills in PE by working with someone else? Who was it and what skills? Was it knowledge? What kind of things that weren't just teaching things, but specific to physical education? And I've put on there the kind of relationships we might be talking about, although there may be other things as well. So that would be really interesting if you could sort of think about that in the chat box over the next couple of slides.
Yeah.
A particular relationship there is the sports coach and the classroom teacher. So this will happen. Brams has already sort of talked about the school sport premium and the use of it. And it's about, if you're using the school sport premium, it's a requirement that the coach works alongside the teacher. This needs to be seen as a two-way relationship. It's often quite a brief relationship, just lasting maybe 40 minutes or an hour a week for 6 weeks or 12 weeks. So the pressure's on to try and make this work. And what coaches tell us really is that it's hard to get time with the teacher to start that relationship. But if we can make it work and make time for it, then what the graphic shows is that perhaps the sports coach, who might not really have heard the term assessment for learning or those processes on their sports coaching qualification courses, could really learn from the school teacher or the TA who it's really bread and butter for them in numeracy and literacy. this idea of planning the learning and checking progress, etc. Likewise, the classroom teacher might, with the sports coaches, help develop their skills of challenge and support within games, because often what happens in PE in our experience is that all children do the same thing all the time, regardless. And actually, sports coaches are well equipped to offer really powerful suggestions for how you might differentiate within PE, no matter what the subject is within PE. So that kind of shows this, again, symbiotic. I'm going to use it again. Yeah, I quite like it. So symbiotic relationship between two practitioners that can help them develop. Noel Srithahan, I hope I've pronounced that correctly. Apologies if not. Something you commented on earlier is that finding the balance between developing each other but also providing a high quality experience for the children. And I think you're quite right. That is a real challenge. It's sometimes you might have to take the brakes off the high quality PE and lose a little bit of control in order to spend a bit of time together as a coach or a teacher or different practitioners to share skills and have chats on the sidelines of your games and your lessons about what you're seeing and what's going on. So I think there is a balance. So hopefully we can do both, but sometimes the long term is better use of your time than the short term. Think about developing yourself so you can develop future children. Another question, as if you haven't got enough to think about, is about how you make time. We've already talked about that a little bit, so keep those ideas coming in. And final bit about relationships, I want to go back to Michelle Obama, who we had on our first screen. My wife's reading a book called Becoming by Michelle Obama. I hope some of you are familiar with it. She's been reading it for far too long, but English is her second language, so I forgive her for that. There's also a really good documentary out there about what Michelle Obama's up to now and the work she's doing in particular with young people, which I watched the other night, and it was really interesting and inspiring, and I'd highly recommend that. One of the things that I really respect her for is how she's managed to make such a difference while also managing a very high pressure marriage. And this is what she has to talk about. When she talks about marriage, she talks about it being a choice you make every day. Some of the literature on co-teaching quite often refers to it as an arranged marriage. And I think we have to embrace it just like we would with any relationship and continue working on it. It can give us lots of rewards, those kind of relationships, but it's something that takes work. And I think Michelle Obama provides that little bit of inspiration to finish this section on relationships.
Fantastic. Great discussion, great insights. Really, really appreciating everybody's comments as they're flying through. I'm hoping the next bit might provide you a little bit of, maybe a little bit of application of some of the things that we've discussed. So I can tell through the chat box that there's a lot of people who've engaged in team teaching or co-teaching that have had some experience of it. But then on the other side, there'll be some people who may be new to this concept. So I think it's very worthwhile looking at this spectrum for models for co-teaching, where it shifts from one end of the spectrum, where you start to see, maybe one teaches, one observe models, or one teaches, one drifts model, where somebody has a real sole responsibility for the planning, for the instruction, for the delivery. And on the other side, when you go right down to the team teaching end at the other side, where there's an equally shared responsibility, where it's a bit of a double act. There's some trust, real high levels of trust there, commitment to the process, planning is astute in terms of how you're going to operate together. And there's a bit of a role play, like Mark alluded to at the very start. I think it's very worthwhile for the audience that we've got in here today to think about how these models could fit the needs in front of you. So what needs and wants are in front of me from my pupils, and which model for co-teaching or team teaching would fit that? Which curriculum topics within the PE national curriculum, when we break it down into Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2, would really fit these models of co-teaching or team teaching? What context are you working in, and where would these models best fit? So when you think about one teacher, one assist models, sometimes people might argue this isn't the best use of people with multiple and diverse talent skill sets. But if, for example, you're wanting somebody to lead in PE and somebody to observe and drift, there could even be a bit of a developmental relationship going on between them two. And I also think it's really important on those types of models to make sure that the lead and the observer stroke drift person are in a position where they're really clear about what they want to do in those particular roles, and make sure that they're really well planned within a medium-term plan of 6 or 12 weeks in a half term or a term. Parallel teaching is excellent for activities where interaction and high levels of maybe sort of like time on task is evident. Joint instruction with the teachers is a very sort of like big key outcome of parallel teaching, and there needs to be a real high level of coordination between the practitioners. It's a model that I'm going to talk about in a minute and really highlight how parallel teaching has helped some practitioners within a primary school bring this to life in PE. Station teaching is really, really good for dividing up instructional content into segments where you can present that to different locations within the room and start to get some real good discussion and perspective sharing about that particular content and how you've broken it down, whether it's some people who need a bit of a higher challenge point in terms of some of the content you're sharing versus some who maybe need it down in some simplified, brilliant basics in terms of how you're putting that information across. Alternative teaching is very much around smaller groups. Really quite good at actually banding there. So you might have a child who may lead it, who's maybe striving in the social corner and might really want to start developing some of the pupils who need some work within that social area with the psychological maybe confidence and esteem. And that's really nice for them to start working in a bit of an alternate teaching way. And the teachers then and practitioners can then really support each other in terms of how that model is working. I'm going to talk to you about a case study now because I really want you to start to dissect this. And most crucially in this section, I want you to think about, could this work in my context? And when I say could, you might think, oh, there's some barriers there straight away there where it wouldn't. And I think what I want you to think is, if there are barriers when you start going through this case study, how could I overcome them? What challenges are in front of me? And what can I do to try and make some of these examples of co-teaching and team teaching come to life? So as I said, I'm going to talk about a case study using a Waggle, so what a good one looks like. And this is through evidence-based. I have the pleasure of going to visit hundreds of primary schools in an academic year across the Manchester area. And this is one that's really stood out to me in terms of celebrating the talents of TAs, HLTAs, PE coaches coming into schools and working with class teachers. So I think we've really got to champion people here. People will bring different skill sets and different abilities to this team teaching role with an overview outcome of developing the pupils. And I think this is really a nice little way to summarize it. So the Waggle, the what a good one looks like. This example was where a primary PE coach had gone into the school under the Premier League Primary Stars banner, which the FAP unit support in terms of the community club organisations that are working and operating in England and Wales. The coach had gone in and worked for an academic year prior. And then when he came into the new academic year, he had a really good understanding of himself, the other people who worked in the schools. He was part of school life. He worked with the teachers across the academic year, working with different classes, with different teachers, with different TAs. And what he wanted to do was put across some key outcomes with the senior leadership team in the school about having some shared drivers, some shared beliefs, and some shared intentions about how team teaching and how co-teaching could come to life within that setting. So in the first instance, it was primarily about the people, the connections, the relatedness, and knowing what benefits that this primary PE coach could do coming into the school, and could also what benefits and challenges that the teachers were facing about delivering PE. How could they work together to celebrate each other's strengths and hopefully get a really good team teaching placing model, which was the key outcome. What happened is that they decided to go for a parallel teaching model. So we've already talked about the parallel teaching model being great for activities where interaction is ongoing, where there's a lot of joint instruction between the practitioners, and that there needs to be a high level of coordination between the practitioners. So in this case, they opted for a parallel teaching model to try and celebrate the strengths and qualities of the people that were in the lesson. So the example was here that they decided through the parallel teaching model that they wanted to lower the practitioner teacher pupil teacher ratio The teacher, a TA who had put in their development and action plan that they wanted to spend some time on PE, was released to work with this PE coach and an array of different class teachers. So the class teachers were always different, but the TA stayed the same across because there was a bit of a development arm for that person to work in this setting. They planned and prepared the lessons jointly, and they decided to look at some practice activities that were physically demanding and challenging for the pupils, where the practitioners had to really look at some key observational skills. And they really had to think about some discussion within the activities for the pupils about, were they doing the right activity for them? Some previous evidence would suggest that PE was always about superimposing the same lesson content for all pupils. But they'd found that that was actually wrong, because if you give the child the same task if you give 30 children the same task, they're not all going to be able to do it. So the parallel teaching model of differentiation was a fantastic way to show pupils the same perspectives in terms of working towards the same learning intention or learning objective during the MTP. Here was the activity. Sometimes, as I just mentioned, we superimpose the same task on all children. But actually, what this team teaching model really noticed was that they needed to use a parallel model where children were given the opportunity to do movement-based tasks, ball in hand-based tasks, ball on floor-based tasks. But crucially, the reason why they were given choice is they were acknowledging the perspectives and feelings of the pupils. They were trying to buy them into the rationale of the lesson to look at these underloaded and overloading, attacking or defending-based invasion games. So what happened is that I want you to visualize here. There's 3 pitches out on the yard. There is a favoured game for the attackers where there's 2 of them against 1 defender. There's an equal-sided base game in the middle. And there's an underloaded game where there are less attackers and more defenders at the other side. And what I want you to visualise is this team teaching model, co-teaching model of parallel teaching coming to life, where a TA might be on one pitch, a teacher might be on another pitch, and the PE coach might be on the other pitch. And they're interacting with the pupils. They're looking at them to see if they're doing the right activities. They're working with individual instructions. They're challenging the pupils to make right decisions for their learning aligned to the learning objective. And this type of practice is really, really good for pupils to make some informed decisions about how they're going to navigate through the system in terms of finding the right activity that's right for them at that time, with the overall outcome of progressing through this, that maybe they're working on a favoured game, 2 attackers against 1 defender, but by the end of the MTP and MTP block, they've made significant progress over the 6 or 12 weeks, where they're starting to do some harder based, physically demanding challenges as a result of making sure that they started at the right point. What I want to really put across to you here now is a triangulated approach. And what I mean by that is, we've talked about models for co-teaching and also for team teaching. We shared that on that spectrum. I've then talked to you about practice design activity with the use of that parallel activity there, where self-choice was evident for the pupils. I now want to explain to you about how the team teaching model for the TA, the PE coach, and the teacher was fantastically designed in terms of the behaviours they were using within that practice. Because they couldn't just do the activity. Here we are, 3 people going to do your team teaching. They had to bring it to life with their teaching behaviours. And this is some of the things that they did. They really differentiated as a pair to make sure that the activities the children were making correct and informed decisions about the activities they were taking. At various points within the lesson, when I was observing this, they took a step back. They use something called Robocop scanning, which is a terminology that I use quite a lot with my teachers and coaches that I work with. In terms of, they take a step back, they observe a pupil, they get the dialogue coming up at the side of the screen, and they think about the intervention tool that they need to use for that child. And what was really nice is the more time they were spending with the pupils, the PE coach, who, even though was an external, was making excellent decisions about the interventions that he could use with the children because he was starting to know them. And he was complementing that by observing and watching the TAs and the teachers working with the pupils as well to gain valuable information from them. So when we're looking at the RoboCop scanning, we're looking to see if the pupils are doing the right things for them at this stage of their learning. And I use something called, and it's there inverted in the comma section, about once is a one-off, twice is a coincidence, and 3 times is a pattern. So if you see an error once, let it go. If you see an error twice, let it go again. Could just be a coincidence. If you see an error again, you might then think about, right, I might need to go and speak to this child about maybe they've gone on to a practice that's deemed where they're getting quite a lot of unsuccessful attempts. Might need to go in there and have a little go at trying to find the right start and challenge point for them within the activity. Drive-by coaching is another great example where we don't have to stop the lesson zoning on somebody who's made a mistake. We can actually go and have a little quick chat, provide an objective or a question or a challenge that aligns to the objective, and then let them have a go. But crucially there, for the people who are listening to this webinar, I think it's really important, as you'll all know, to check back in on that challenge or question that you've posed to them. Because ultimately, if we've asked them something, we need to review it, and that formative assessment to help them in the journey is really, really key. To maximise some interaction while teaching, I think it's really important to stress here that this wonderful example of a teacher, a TA and a PE coach who worked fantastically together in this symbiotic relationship, that's a key word that's coming out quite a lot at the minute, in terms of where they were excellent at reflecting in action. They had a plan. The activity was coming together in the parallel activities. But what they did was that they were really good at standing back and thinking, well, actually, if the plan's not going where we want it to go, let's be comfortable about letting it go a little bit and seeing if we have some benefits for the pupils here. So the things they were reflecting on as team teachers and co-teachers in this parallel teaching model were things like interventions. Is the practice right? Do we need some extensions? Is the tempo of the lesson right? Are they getting enough goals? Have they got a high number of repetition? What's the play time like versus the talk time? They were really good at coordinating as practitioners during this model. And ultimately, as we know, as practitioners on this model, on this webinar today, that if we reflect, it helps inform where we go next. The definition and the bedrock of assessment for learning is about understanding where our learners are at, where we want to take them, and how we're going to get there. And that's a relationship between pupils and teachers. And this example of co-teaching and team teaching, they were really good at shaping where this MTP journey was going. They weren't saying that next week we're going to do this, and week 3 was already planned, and week 4 was already planned, and week 5 were already planned. They were there in the moment, understanding this is where the pupils have got to, and I'll start there again next week without trying to deliver some different set of content. And the final thing from me, before we start to really look at a 10-minute consolidation between us as hosts and you as the audience of today's webinar, is that if I had to sum up what I saw at that school, it was amazing what they accomplished when actually nobody cared about what credit. Nobody cared about the credit of taking the positives of that situation. It was a real inbuilt culture. It was front and center of it was connections, rapport, and relationships. But the key message for me was the TA has unbelievable qualities and strengths. The teacher has brilliant ideas and pedagogical knowledge of how to deliver the lesson. The PE coach brought some significant knowledge to that fore as well. But the marriage and that relationship between the three really showed for me that with time, not rushed, team teaching can be really effective and beneficial for the pupils. And that's something I want you to really reflect on in terms of when you commit to action about what team teaching you could enter when you get back into the new normal with classes in September. I want to hand you over to my colleagues now for a 4-way discussion where we really take your valuable points and your excellent comments to the fore now with a bit of Q&A. Mark, just unmute yourself, Mr. Carter, my other colleague. Fantastic. Here we go.
Maker. All right. Thanks, mate. a quick one for me. Just I'm sensing in the chat there's quite a bit of I wish that happened in my school, and there's a lot of different contexts out there. And I do get it. If you're in a school where you've got SLT and a lot of pressure that isn't about PE, and PE isn't really celebrated, this is much more difficult. But I think this is a battle we're all in. We're all in as colleagues, and I would just implore you to keep fighting for this subject. Keep trying to bang the drum about it. Keep starting conversations in the staff room. Keep making sure those lessons happen for your class. Keep encouraging and supporting whoever the PE lead is in there. Ask for inset time and don't give up on it. It's easy to get into the culture of it's just PE otherwise, especially if it's your NQT or you're just starting next year. And keep positive about it. It is difficult, but we're all in it together, and we can make a difference. It's a marathon, not a sprint, but keep at it. And I do sympathise though with those.
Yeah, just on that, I think your comments there. It's great for you to relay that back to me, Mark. And I think what I want really to put across there is that, you know, we've painted an example to you there, but I want you to think about what works for you in your context and why. And if that is team teaching and co-teaching between a teacher and a TA, or two teachers, and it's not or a TA and a PE coach, or a teacher and a PE coach, and it's in isolation, well, make that work for you. It doesn't always have to be the ultimate PE unit, PE leadership team, a senior leadership team down and providing a big culture. What I want you to really think about is what works for you in your scenario and why, and how can you come over barriers. We're painting you some pictures today, and it's about you trying to think about where you can find that solution. So we don't expect everybody to be having that example of a Waggle that we've shared, but it's about you trying to find what works for you in your context. And I think it's a really big personal development tool that you could speak to your senior managers about within those respective schools.
Something, a thing that is coming across, Chris. It's been great just to read some of the success stories as well that have been in the chat box around things that have really worked. And a common theme around that is when both parties, whoever that is, whether it's a TA and a teacher or a coach and a teacher, when both parties are actively involved in the plan, do and review process. And it's not just a case of turning up to a lesson, right, what are we doing today? You know, what have you planned today? It's, you know, delivering things that they've planned together. And it might be that, you know, the teacher knows the class needs better than an external coach, for example, who are coming in.
Correct.
But,
yeah.
And, you know, I'm gonna give you an example just from, I'm going to use my mum as an example, actually. She'll be really proud that she's got a mention. But she's a TA at a school in Middlesbrough. And she's got a fantastic relationship with the Year 6 teacher that she works with. And they, you know, I know it's different in school to schools, but they value PE the same as numeracy, the same as literacy. And so they make sure that they plan their PE lessons together, reflect on them together. And they're both clear of the learning objectives and the role that they will play in meeting them. And it'll depend on lesson as to which model they might use. And you've outlined some there brilliantly, Chris, as to which ones they might use. But, you know, they're both part of that process.
Yeah.
And I understand that it might be, you know, I know just from the comments that there's a lot of schools who are getting external coaches in. And, you know, it might be that time is a challenge, and Mark's referred to that, but I think it is just looking at, right, well, what can we do in the short time that we have? And, you know, for those external coaches, you know, things like break time, lunchtime, what do they do? You know, it might be that they're, you know, 18, 19 years old. They might be coming into a school for the first time. They might be a little bit intimidated about stepping into that environment. And yes, they're really confident when they're teaching PE, but outside of that, do they need a little bit of support? You know, have they been invited into the staff room to eat the lunch rather than going out to the car? And, you know, I think that's the time, you know, going back right to the beginning to when we talked about building relationships and that being the key to team teaching. It's what can we do? You know, yes, time's always going to be a premium in primary schools. We know that from being teachers ourselves, but, you know, it's what things can we do to make sure that we maximize the time and increase the time we can.
Yeah, I just had a great question. I just read a comment there. Jane, Paul, and Tom have just talked about, does a parallel teaching model need to have a number of practitioners about the pictures that they have? And the answer is no. I think the more you embed a parallel approach that, you know, ultimately might look at self-choice, buying the pupil into the rationale of the lesson, the more you do that type of stuff, the pupils will respond to it, and they'll be able to look after themselves on the pitches, and it might be that you can do that with 2 people. I know from experience walking out, I've seen people do that with just 1 person. So I think it's about that triangulated approach for me. You know, what model, what practice design, and what behaviours am I going to use? That triangulated approach is crucial, and I think if you start to get those together, I think you're in a real strong process in terms of, getting some outstanding benefits for your pupils. Chris, have you had any other questions that have popped up during your navigation of the comments?
Yeah, too many to mention, in fact, but one I'm going to pick up on really is just around how you can make the most of having, and a lot of you refer to sports coaches coming into your schools, and it's just around making the most of that opportunity. Because we've never had an opportunity quite like this that we've had over the last sort of 4 or 5 years, really, to take advantage of those external people to come and team teach with us. But I'm going to go back to Mary's point right at the beginning around that symbiotic relationship. So think about what you want to get from that sports coach in terms of your learning and development, but equally share your professional approach and teaching and learning skills with that sports coach and ask what they want to learn from you. And that's where that real symbiotic relationship will happen. That they can pick up something for their professional development because they've probably not done a PGCE or a BEd like we might have done, but they've got some experiences that we might not have in terms of sport-specific stuff. So it's really just sharing and picking each other's brains and helping each other out to both become better practitioners for the benefit of the pupils at the end, really.
Yeah, I think it's the biggest sort of like signpost that we've got here is that we've put some top tips on there for you, but you've ultimately got to trial and you've got to experiment with these things, and it's been really, really good to see some fantastic insights coming across the board. Anything else that you've seen, Mark, that have popped up during your reflection time?
I think given that we've got a couple of minutes left, and I don't want to overrun, I think it would be good now to signpost forward. In terms of handouts and things, they are available. There's within that chat box. There's a little handouts bit. You will also get a link emailed to you with a recording of this presentation. But I want to leave the final word really over to Chris Bramwell, who's delivering next week. I'll just put the slide up that shows where we're at with this. So that's our 4-week program. Chris is leading next week on reconnecting through PE, and we really hope that if you've taken something from this in the last 2 weeks, you'll be there for that. So I'm going to pass over to Chris to finish up, just to signpost us forward to next week, what we can expect.
Thanks, Mark. And a couple of people have picked up on this already. Rumit and Stephen have already been asking around what will PE look like with social distancing when we go back. So we're going to start to pick up on that theme a little bit next week. We're also going to start looking at how we could use physical education from a holistic development perspective. So the curriculum as was may not fit anymore when we go back. We might need to start look at the more social, psychological angles of physical education, developing and reinstalling those traits with our children to reconnect with them through PE, which is a great subject to be able to do that. So we're certainly not going to have all the answers because we've never been in this situation before, but we're going to start to explore what it might look like as a start point, just to try and help you and look forward to what might be on the horizon for us all.
Good, and I think it's really important for you to stay connected with us. We've thoroughly enjoyed as a P unit of 20 plus staff delivering this first in the initial series of the webinars, and we've got our Twitter handle there at FAP unit. We've also got our fa.com/learning link directs to our education pages where you can find out more, not just from the P unit, but from the wider education offers that the FA provide. But I think from Mark Carter, from Ryan Davies, from Chris Bramwell, and from myself, it's been an absolute pleasure to take you through an introduction, really, an insight into team teaching and co-teaching models. And we hope that you've taken the opportunity to download the handouts, which are available, and your certificates within the tabs in front of you. And all that leads us to say is a massive thank you. Stay safe, look after yourselves and your family, and we look forward to welcoming you to further FAP unit events in the future. whether that's next week or looking ahead. Thank you for now.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.